Mentally, it's as close as I've seen.
Okay, so yeah, so we're doing the second half of chapter 2 today. I'm kind of letting the audio one get towards the middle because that's a real downside of the audio on the YouVersion app is that I don't have a way to just start it in the middle.
Yeah. That's very poverty-esque. Like you are the go-to Bible app. But nope, sorry, you gotta start talking at the very beginning.
Yeah, like
there's gotta be
even YouTube has like a little like how do you not have?
There's gotta be somewhere.
Yeah, I'm imagining that there's a way, and maybe I just don't know what it is.
Do you need a internet connection to play the audio, or is it just downloaded?
I don't actually know.
I don't think they're just like streaming it.
Didn't we end at the?
I don't.
Was verse 17?
Yeah, I don't know. So we ended at verse 17. So we're gonna start on verse 18.
Is the plan to just do these next 10 verses?
Yeah. The plan is literally just do the next two. Yeah. So we might be kind of sitting on a couple of these for like a while.
6 minutes of verse.
Yeah, basically. So how about I'll just start it here. Even though I'm not there yet.
Tax collectors and sinners were reclining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And when Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners."
Okay. So just to remember where we're coming from, he's just called Levi, which like in this so far he really hasn't had like an instance other than like Peter, right? He's still in like this like gradual process of like gathering all of his disciples together, and he's about to have an instance of people questioning his disciples. And so that's where we start off.
Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins."
Okay.
Jesus, we were just talking about fasting.
Right. So this whole passage, right, it's kind of goofy. And I was kind of actually going to ask, how have you guys been taught about what this like new wineskin, old wineskins, like how have you been taught, like what does that mean? Like what is that indicating?
I got taught that it's like, oh, you become a Christian, you got to live a different type of lifestyle now.
Okay.
That's what it was.
Okay. And I was going to say basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Is that because I confuse this with the like unequal yokes. I confuse that with this one.
Okay. Yeah. That
like not in terms of meaning, but in my head, when he says this, he also says that like with it. That's what I mean. It just gets kind of jumbled in my head because they both say to me just like,
well, it's not here.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Are you meant
but okay.
the Bible right now?
Maybe. I mean, he did it a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And because with the yoke one, I just think of just like, oh well, if you're a man of God, don't marry someone who is not.
Yeah, that's usually the way that one works.
Which is also kind of what I project a meaning onto this.
Okay.
That's
Interesting.
again, that's coming from
Well,
Mandela
But it
effect.
is like I kind of get where you're seeing that though, because there is a little bit of like a don't mix sort of
that's
thing
that's what it. Yeah,
w-
that's what it
with
is.
this.
I kind of get like the whole salt water doesn't come out of a freshwater spring and fresh water doesn't come out of salt water. I kind of get those vibes from this verse.
Okay. So
That's how we're all so wrong.
yeah, so
I'm ready.
I am going to say
I'm ready.
that's the way that I've always kind of heard it too, and I've always really heard people like kind of draw into this idea of like Jesus is coming to make a new covenant, and so that's why like we can just kind of get rid of the Old Testament,
Yeah, like the
and
old-
so like the old
covenant
thing doesn't
connected
matter.
that
We just
one.
get rid of it. Like Jesus is bringing a new thing now, and after we talk about it a little bit, I'm going to get to the bottom of my notes. There's a way in which that sort of works, but it's really wrong. And actually, if you look closely at what it's talking about, it kind of doesn't make any sense. What were you going to say, Jeremy?
Something that popped in my head because of a recent conversation. You're talking about how, like, people of this age don't really have an interest in churches that still do hymnals and stuff like that. And people from those churches, like the elderly people, they still show up in like their full suits. They
Yep.
miss the hymnals, but like, you know what I'm saying?
They like the tradition and everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
So you were told that maybe that's what that person thinks this is about, or that just
No,
made you think of it.
Or
it just
you.
made me think.
Okay.
I mean, yeah. They're so yeah. So like the way that I think that kind of ties out in with this is there's this idea, right, that it starts off with it of all right. There's a little bit of an accusation that maybe their disciples aren't as like dedicated, right? Because like, look, John's disciples and the Pharisees, they fast. Why aren't your disciples fasting, right? And so you have this, right? Like Jesus is showing up on the scene. He's still relatively new, right? In the Gospel of Mark, we don't fully really know even what his teaching is specifically, except for that like he went around preaching the gospel to everybody, and it's like cool. And we haven't really gotten like a big like thing about what his teaching is yet. You will get that in like in later chapters. But you have this right this question about criticizing their like dedication is related to that through line question of like who Jesus is. And in his answer, he's going to be answering both of those things, right? And so he starts off with, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? So immediately what he's doing is he's referring to himself as a bridegroom, which is a weird thing to do. As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. There are other places in the Gospels, and I'm messing up my memory here, but I think other places even within Mark where Jesus uses this same kind of language where he's like constantly like referring to himself as a bridegroom, which on first blush, like again, it's like, oh, this is just a parable, so he's just likening himself to that. But again, there's all of this kind of veiled. If you go back and read the Old Testament, how does the Old Testament describe like the language of Israel in comparison to Yahweh? It's Yahweh is the husband of Israel, and Israel is the wife of Yahweh, and Israel needs to be faithful. Right. But in here, you have these kind of like these same like ideas, but it's sort of mixed a little bit because like they're guests, right? And but you still have these like kind of undertones that are there. But then you also have the line, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. So already just with that line, the common teaching of, oh, Jesus is coming to just say that he's like replacing the Old Testament sort of doesn't make sense for a number of reasons. One, the whole thing is about fasting, which is a thing that Christians still do, right? So it's not really related to just Old Testament practices or Old Covenant stuff. It's related to fasting. It's not related to covenant stuff. Two, it says that they will be doing those things in the future. And so if it's about coming and replacing the Old Covenant and about replacing the old system, why would he be saying that, oh, that thing that you used to do, I'm here to replace that, but also, by the way, you're going to be doing it eventually, right? Like, so that kind of understanding of it doesn't really make sense with what he's actually talking about here. And then you go into the really weird part, which is no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, a patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But the new wine is for fresh wineskins. Okay, so let's think about, like, in a very literal fashion, right? So that we can get the mental picture that Jesus is trying to, like, paint here. Let's think about what he's saying, right? So you have an old garment that's already shrunk, right? And so if you attach a new one to it, whenever that one gets washed, it pulls away. So it shrinks away and it collapses and it causes problems.
And that's new on old.
That's new being
Or
attached to
old.
old.
But
The
first
other,
thing he says is unshrunken old.
yeah, well, because unshrunk is the new, right?
Okay.
Unshrunk is the new.
They haven't put it through the wash.
They haven't put it through the wash yet. The old one has already shrunk, pre-shrunk, and so it shrinks and rips away from it. The other one is an expansion, right? So this one's talking about pre-shrunk. The new wineskins, right, is talking about the old wineskins have already expanded, because if you put wine, so what does wine do, right? It ferments, and like bread, whenever something like ferments, it makes gases and it causes expansion. And so when you put wine into a wineskin and it ferments and makes gases, it expands, right? And the issue is that if you then pour that out and then put new wine into there, well, it's already expanded. And so because of that, if you put new stuff in there, it'll burst because it doesn't have any more room to expand. So he's like, well, we got new stuff here. And so one is about shrinking and one is about expanding. But they're both meant to point to the same thing, which is conditioned over time, right? If you try to take something that's been conditioned over time to do this, like this act, and if you don't condition it properly, it's going to break, like, the system. And so to me, what he's really talking about here is really actually a practical lesson about training his disciples, right? Because he's not saying they're never going to fast. He's saying they're not fasting now. And you have to also remember the difference in Jesus's disciples between, right? Because we talked about this last time. Jesus is just picking up a bunch of random guys off of the street, and he's like, I'm going to make you into disciples. Whereas other groups of disciples, usually what they're doing is having a bunch of people that were already trained, that were then coming to, like, rabbis and groups and being like, oh, we're going to now train you further since you already have all of this stuff. Exactly. It's like a graduate school thing. And what Jesus is saying here is, like, there's going to time whenever they're going to get to that, but they're not there yet. And also the reason for it has to do with, so there's a bunch of stuff that's going on, right? So Jesus is making a self-identification about who he is. He's also predicting his death, right? Because he's predicting that there's going to be a time whenever he's gone. But he's also saying right now, they're not ready for that. There's going to be a time when they are ready for that. But I'm putting new stuff into them right now. And then in the future, there's going to have time where they expand or contract or are going to be able to fit into the system properly. And then they're going to be able to function the way that you are expecting them to function.
What's also interesting about and obviously as the through line, and you mentioned it in that explanation, is that the back half of that like parable or like almost simile that he's putting up here,
Right.
like gets divorced from the idea of the fasting question. You mentioned like as soon as we started, you were just like, we were just talking about a fast. Like,
Right,
what's going on?
They were probably just like, Jesus, you're
But
faded.
Right.
but obviously there is a through line, and they are referring to the same thing, and it seems to be hitting on what you were saying as well, but also a general topic of like there is a time for everything.
Yes.
And in this instance, it's saying, okay, when is the time to fast? Well, it's not when you're celebrating. When you're celebrating,
Yes.
it's not time to fast.
Yes.
And so he's comparing celebrating or fasting while you're celebrating is like mixing old and new. And he put up two different examples of old and new at the same time. When you mix old and new at the same time, what happens is you ruin the whole.
And that's also going to be related to, I'm spoiling a little bit here, but that's the thing that relates this story to the next story, which is about breaking Sabbath, where it's the same thing of there's a time and a place for it. And you have to understand the spirit that underlies the thing that you are doing to know when to do it, right? Because the next story is going to be about how to act properly on the Sabbath and kind of when can you break the Sabbath. Whereas this one is about a practical practice, which is fasting, and knowing, okay, when do you fast and when do you not fast? And the point is, and it's exactly to make this point of it, there's a lot of Jesus doing like balancing stuff, right? Of being like, and you'll see this throughout like of people being like, oh, we need to be super hardcore about like this certain thing. And then there are other people that are like, well, no, we need to be super, super lax about this thing. And you'll see that across Christianity, right? You'll see some people that are like, we need to do everything that the Old Testament says to do, and we need to do it to the letter, and like blah, 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 and like everything hardline. And then you'll have other people that are like, we shouldn't even tell people that there's sin in hell because like that's too much, right? And the point is like, no, there's a place for each of these things, and you need to know when to apply them. And how do you know when to apply them is that relationship with Christ. It's that relationship with a person.
Because what I'm relating it to is the same lesson. Well, it's like the same thing he says whenever, like, I believe it's Mary breaks the like alabaster jar of like perfume. Because what he says then is that you'll always have the poor with you.
Yes.
But I am just here for a limited time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the same idea of like there is a rank and priority of things that you need to attend with at a given time. And it's about understanding what you're in and dealing with to then respond accordingly. Like you're not gonna fast during a wedding.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you could even relate it to just give the opposite end of this, which again, I'm breaking what I said to do. But if you go to John and you read the miracle of Cana, right? And whenever Jesus turns water into wine, right? It's very clear that, right? Because a lot of times we want to give, especially like, I mean, like, I don't drink, right? But we want to, especially in like Pentecostal circles and everything, we want to give this stark answer, which I think is correct, which is like you drinking alcohol is not a sin, but getting drunk is, right? Like I think that's a fair rule. 98% of the time. The one exception to that, kind of weddings. And the thing is, like, if you look at that story, the people in that story that Jesus is giving very good alcohol to are very clearly, they're probably drunk. Like, they probably are.
Does that mean that Jesus gave them the blessing to be drunk?
So it becomes this very weird thing of
I mean, like,
people don't know.
If Jesus is tempting people with that kind of alcohol, he's not really tempting them with that kind of alcohol. I mean, you could say what Pastor said, like if he's going to give you the opportunity to get drunk, he's also going to give you the one not to.
Right. But but what I'm saying is that what's probably going on is that in that connotation, it's probably not a sin. I can think of of other examples where this is actually the case. A big one, an obvious one, kind of related to weddings, is sex, right? Sex in any normal context, completely wrong. You shouldn't be doing it. But within the confines of a marriage, it's the correct thing to do, and actually becomes a thing where if you don't do that, you're actually causing a problem. And so there's like, there seems to be some kind of rule for like celebration and a rule for like, okay, maybe there are certain, and like I say this, I've been to plenty of weddings, never gotten drunk at one, right? And like,
Sounds like you just tried to preach.
I know.
Weddings now.
You're not getting proper thrashed at the night.
My point is that like my point is to actually say that we probably like, I think if we're doing like, right, what pastors like trying to advocate for is like good exegetical like understanding of what the Bible is trying to say. It seems to me that it's trying to say that like, okay, at certain points you can let this go. And actually this will become even more clear. And the next thing is that just because we let something go, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was like, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was right, if that makes sense. Like there's a difference between like something being morally right or something being against the law or really even something being a sin.
Mhm.
And like there's all kinds of
good decision.
right, like we like to wrap all of those things up into the same thing. But one of the things that Jesus is dealing with right here is that like not everything can be so easily wrapped up and fall under the same banner, because like I'm jumping ahead to like the next part, so forgive me. But like, and then in the next portion, they're going to call what the disciples do unlawful. And very technically, what the disciples do is not unlawful. And technically, in a certain way, it is in fact lawful. But then Jesus gives an example of something to give him clearance for what he's about to say that is explicitly unlawful, that he uses to be like, that means that what my disciples did was okay. And so it's a very like tricky thing. We'll get into that more when we read a little bit next section. But yeah.
Does that kind of tie in whenever Paul goes the whole like everything is permissible but not everything is beneficial? Is that like a same?
I think so. I tend to think of that in like the same like line of thinking in vein. It's a thing. It's a theme that's kind of throughout the Old Testament and New. Right, it's in Ecclesiastes, which right is obviously there. It's in Proverbs. It's in a lot of places of just it really is, in my opinion, it's the fundamental aspect of wisdom. What wisdom really is fundamentally is knowing when to apply certain truths and understanding that truth. And this is why I try to tie it to a person. And this is why when Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," and he ties those concepts to a person, it's one of the reasons why I think it's one of the most profound statements, even on like a philosophical level. It's one of the most profound statements that has maybe ever been said. Because we even try to think of this way of objective truth versus subjective truth and like this relationship and everything. And I'm for even something can be true in one sense, but it's also not true in the sense that actually matters, that actually prioritizes, right? So I've talked about this like during youth or whatever, where I'm like, okay, let's say you have something like you failed a test on a strictly like materialist basis, like that is a true statement. But a lot of times it's like, oh, well, if you failed a test, therefore you are a failure. Like that's a classification. And by technical terms, if you failed a test or you failed something, you therefore are a failure. But that statement isn't applied with a correct frame. And what Christianity says is the correct frame is you look at things through how Jesus sees them, through how God sees them. And so Jesus acts as your frame. And so in the frame of like Christ, you may have failed at some task, but in actuality, that doesn't characterize your whole being. And there's more to you than just that label of that. And so all of these ideas people like get and understand. And that's why you'll hear people say things like, we don't like labels, don't label yourself, or like don't, or like, that's not true, right? You'll and this is why we have this problem of like my truth and everything, right? Because people still take that kind of idea about taking something that's like material true in like one sense, but then seeing it through a different frame. But the issue is that whenever that frame is their own lens and not like, right? So Pastor said something interesting on Sunday where he said, it's not subjective. And I thought he was going to say objective because in most like philosophical things, those are the terms that everybody uses. Opposite of subjective is objective. And he said, it's absolute. and I was like, did you just use like the wrong word there? And I was like, he probably did. He probably didn't like have any thought to like what language he was really using there. But in another sense, I kind of like what he said. And so I was like, no, it's absolute in that like there's an external grounding that like he used it in a way of like objective, but in a way of being like, you don't debate with it, right? That's kind of what absolute means, right? And so I was like, okay, there's a way in which I sort of actually like that terminology that you use, even though I'm not 100% you used it.
I definitely wasn't thinking what you thought when he said that. But now that you say that, it's kind of funny.
But so I kind of got lost in the weeds there with what I was trying to say. I don't know if I still like interrupt like what you were saying or if you were done.
I think you just kind of ran with the point I made. I didn't. Yeah.
Okay.
It was all pretty good. The only thing that you got me thinking. You mentioned one thing that that stuck out to me while you're talking about that was that a lot of this is nailing on like the concept of what wisdom actually is in a practical sense,
right?
And it's likely something like this. You have never gotten drunk at a wedding,
right?
But it would probably be unwise if at your wedding you forbid everyone from getting drunk.
Yes,
and that's probably. I think there's something there.
At the same time, it's not necessarily wise for you yourself to get drunk at a wedding too.
Right.
But if there was going to be a time that you did do that,
and especially
that would be the time, right?
Because that's because I think you would cause more problems if you forbid everyone at your wedding from the possibility of getting drunk. Because then there might actually be a fight that actually like comes out of that.
Right.
Or are you saying like just don't have alcohol served at a wedding? Because I've been to a lot of those.
No, no.
Do you mean like, hey everybody, there's alcohol, but don't you touch it? Like,
or like, don't you drink it too much?
Or you can have it, but if I see, but I'm gonna constantly be taking your guys' test.
Yeah, exactly.
Your alcohol levels above such and such.
Right. That's probably an issue.
Okay.
Right. And also like, and again, I also think that it would be wrong in this situation to say that like every other person should run their wedding in the same way, right? I don't
Obviously,
think
being
we
in a
want to make a
Christian
hard and
crowd,
fast rule about how people should like function at weddings.
There's gonna be a lot of
Like-
weddings without alcohol in the
Yeah,
Christian
yeah, there's gonna be a lot
Right,
that
And so
don't
then
have
it'll be
out.
like the opposite problem potentially being like, oh, here's alcohol and get drunk. Then people might fight because there is this, like, why do you have alcohol here?
But the point is less on the same point about alcohol. It is more about like, okay, there are times when-
Generalizing
there are
that
times when
principle.
things are appropriate, and even if you personally wouldn't engage, it probably isn't best to deny other people of this at a time when it would be acceptable.
That makes sense.
Another thing is alcohol is very expensive at weddings.
Bring your own alcohol.
I'm gonna be honest. I kind of think that the main reason why I'm able to take like so much time off of work is mostly because I don't drink. Seriously, so many people like the amount of money they spend on alcohol is insane to me. Like it's really normal. It's really normal for people to spend like whenever I was working in Alabama, it was really normal for people to easily spend like 30 to 40 bucks a night like on alcohol. And I was like, people are crazy. What are you doing?
That's a lot.
Yeah. And that's specifically why at their company, they had company cards to pay their food, didn't cover alcohol. I was like, geez. But
I think
anyways.
the other big disclaimer is the fact that weddings are almost synonymous with hooking up with people you don't know, like in the secular world. So
I mean, yeah, that's probably
there's like the spirit of weddings where it's like, I don't know what it is, but like just like the romance that goes into it, and it's like if everyone were drunk, even if it's like everyone that I've grown up with in church, it's like we're still sinful by nature. So I don't know if I'd want to subject myself to that kind of situation.
No, yeah.
And that's like something that you need to take into account. But at the same time, it doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. And I do agree with you that it's a point that no one's ever made, but maybe no one wants to make it because no one trusts their.
You gotta make a
Little
wise
wise.
choice to know your
And
I mean, if it's an ugly wedding, then sure, I'm getting plastered. But then again, if I get so plastered, I might just take the first thing I see home with me.
That is not the advice we're giving.
That's what I'm saying. So don't get drunk if you don't trust yourself.
I
You
mean,
don't
hey,
wake up and you're
hey.
like, gosh darn, I forgot it was an ugly wedding.
Why not? Oh, I
You're
should've had that last
you're
vodka.
doing surveys at the wedding just to like let's just check what's the average going on here. All right.
4.5. Ooh.
So to try and take this to try and salvage how I think that there is a way in which you can kind of relate this to like the old / new covenant idea though, is that with the symbols themselves, right? So he picks garments and he picks wine, right? And we think of those with some of the like symbolic representations that we've seen like in Old Testament, whenever we were doing all that stuff. You have like the garments of skin. The garments of skin are this like device that is used to like fix or correct the fall, right? Because they fall, and then the Lord provides garments of skin. And then you also have, for a lack of a better term, communion, right? And that anytime where like God is like meeting with people, they have bread and wine. Bread's going to show up in the next story, but like you got wine, and that shows the trying to like rejoin of like heaven and earth, rejoining with God, which is what we do in communion. We're identifying with Christ. We are joining with Him, and so there is a way in which kind of what he's saying there is that he is bringing new wineskins, right? And a wineskin itself, right? So like if we go back and read it just really carefully, right? New is made from the old, and the worst tear is made. and then he has talks about like wineskins, and he says, but new wine is for fresh wineskins, right? And so he very explicitly, so in just even like the phrase wineskin, you kind of have an idea, something that is both for wine and is also a skin, which garments of skin, right? So like kind of connect them there. And so there is this idea of he's bringing like new wineskins, which so he's bringing that, but also kind of in the symbol they're like the people, and he's pouring into them new stuff, and that's representing a new thing that he's doing. And so on one hand, I don't want us to get into the habit of saying, I think the evangelical church is mostly in the habit of trying to like dismiss the Old Testament altogether, and I don't want us to do that. But at the same time, I don't want to leave out the fact that Jesus isn't just another Jewish prophet. He's not just a rabbi that's coming along. He is very fundamentally doing a different thing. And so I don't want to ignore the fact that Jesus is doing something new. Okay. And this kind of goes into that question of like, that we're talking about who is Jesus? Is Jesus just a rabbi that was like a lot of rabbis at the time that was going around doing that was preaching and stuff? Or is he actually bringing something new? He is actually bringing something new. But in time, right, as his ministry goes on and as his disciples expand, the idea is that the function that it's going to serve should serve as the same function of what it was doing beforehand, right? And so the function that the Torah and that the old covenant system was utilizing, the service that it was applying to the world, the new thing that Christ is going to bring over time is supposed to serve in that similar function. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So there is that in there, but I wanted to go through that because I didn't want it to be the lazy understanding of, oh, we can ignore everything in the Old Testament and ignore all context of the fact that like there's a way in which we're going to be doing the things because we're going to be fasting and we're going to be doing fasting and like whenever we get to the next portion where we're talking about Sabbath, we're going to be doing Sabbath like in some capacity, right? We're not just going to ignore it totally. There's going to be a way in which we do it and that we utilize Sabbath, but it's going to be in a new way, and we're not just ignoring it.
And then I never said what I usually think of whenever I think of this verse, but it's purely that last line, but new wine is for fresh wineskins. That to me brings up the imagery or like the idea of needing to be born again, and also the idea of like the circumcision of the heart, which like Paul talks about.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of like that's why like
and
it's a change in us.
And those are new things.
Yeah.
Right. There's a way in which those are new things, but they don't make sense unless you know what the old things were.
Right.
Right. Like circumcision of the heart doesn't make a lick of sense unless you know what circumcision did and how it functioned in the society. And so if you just try to throw out the old stuff, the new stuff makes no sense. And then it becomes blah, and people do whatever, and people just start making up crap. And that's what we want to avoid, right? All right.
One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath."
Okay. So, a couple things here. We'll try and hit some of the practical stuff first. What are they doing? They're walking through the field, right? They're plucking heads of grain, and probably like rubbing them together to get the chaff off of them, and so they can like eat them. And they get accused of doing what's not lawful on the Sabbath. Technically, what they did should have been fine, because what they're doing is gleaning, right? And so, according to normal gleaning laws, as long as you are not using like a tool, like a sickle, as long as you're not using a tool, you can, as you're going through somebody's field, you can take some of the grain and eat it. Like, it's fine. And technically, even like after the harvest, some portions of the land are supposed to be intentionally left for gleaning, right? This is, go back and read Ruth. This is what Ruth is doing, right? The issue is that they're saying that they shouldn't have been doing it on the Sabbath. Well, that's a tradition that came up, and if that, as certain scholars were trying to explicit what it meant to do work, they started classifying. I forget like what it is, but it's like a lot of like really intrinsic stuff about like doing stuff with like your hands is like not, certain things like with your hands is not allowed. And like, actually, it was funny. I even watched like a Ben Shapiro, Lex Friedman podcast came out like, I think it was like today or yesterday or whatever. And in it, he kind of very quickly talked about like the different stuff that's like allowed on the Sabbath or whatever. And he said that mostly he reads just random books like on the Sabbath, but he doesn't use highlighters because using a highlighter is considered work. So instead, he uses little tabs, and he puts tabs on the paper so that he can mark different stuff that he likes. And then he gives those books to where he literally hires somebody that he gives the books to, that then write down all the things that he tabbed so that he can use them for quotes later. And it's like, Ben, you're doing the same thing, right? But just in one, you're using your hand like this, and in another, you're picking up a tool, right? Because that's what a highlighter is. You're picking up a tool and you're like using it in a certain way. And there's all kinds of very weird like laws and stuff like that surrounding Sabbath that Jews utilize. And I mean, maybe I'm biased because I'm a Christian, but it really seems like it's like, okay, at a certain point, you've kind of lost the spirit of what's going on here with this whole no work thing. And it was one of the things that I had looked up like a couple weeks ago, which I forgot to do today. But like, there are jobs that you can have still on the Sabbath, like even in like Israel and stuff, right? So like things like you're a doctor, and Ben Shapiro knows this a lot, and he talks about it because his wife's a doctor. And he's talked about how he actually really likes Uber, because one of the things that he was able to do with Uber was they could pre-order Ubers to pick up his wife so that she could get to work, so that she could work on Saturdays, which is whenever the Sabbath is, but she's not allowed to drive on Sabbath. So she has to get somebody to come and get her. But also, they can't order them because they can't use their phones on Sabbath. And so he has to order them ahead of time, schedule them, and then have someone take them. And then
The Jews use the telegram concept?
I don't know.
I'm sure that's a tool.
I don't know the ins and outs of how they did it, but like one of the things is that you're not allowed to press buttons. And so like in Israel, a lot of the big buildings in Israel, their elevators have what's called a Sabbath mode, which is so on the Sabbath, literally the elevators just go to every single floor, open and close in order so that the elevator still works, and it will eventually get you all the way down, and it will eventually take you all the way up, but you don't have to press any of the buttons as you go along it. And so like so it's stuff like that. They even also have things that are like really weird where like certain very, very like particular ones, you're not allowed to like leave your house. And so then there's a big debate about what is a house. So I believe one of the things that they do is they'll have like these like pillars that they'll like set up on a house, and then they tie a rope from one building to another building. And what that does is that connects the buildings. So then therefore the whole thing is one house. And so in some Jewish neighborhoods, they'll literally connect like every single building so that like the whole town is like technically one house.
It's like
So therefore you can then walk to like all of like
so
the
God
houses.
is like the sea bear, and but then he sees your rope connecting your house. He's like, "Oh, you're safe from my wrath. Watch yourself."
Right. And so like this is this
You
is
gotta
like
make that meme now.
it's very clear to me that with like some of these things, it's like, okay, you're losing the plot.
That's
Of,
Jesus'
like-
whole, his big
Right.
theme with the Pharisees is like they're just exaggerating.
And that's exactly what's going on here. Is like he's like, you guys have lost the plot. You're saying that something is unlawful whenever it's not. And then what does Jesus do to respond? So he says, have you never read when David was hungry and he was in need, and those who were with him, right? So he's making kind of a comparison between himself and David, and then those who were with him with his disciples, and how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest. So if you want to know where the story is, can someone go to 1 Samuel 21? Well, someone want to read that real quick?
My bad. I went to the first instance of when the Sabbath got made. I was looking at that.
Get out of here. We don't need that.
I'll talk about that
Samuel
later.
chapter 21,
1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1.
21st Samuel, chapter 1.
verse 1.
Yeah, verse 1.
David-
Go for it.
David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?"
Keep going. Keep.
Okay. David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find.' But the priest answered David, 'I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women.' David replied, 'Indeed, women have been kept from us, as usual whenever I set out. The men's bodies are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?' So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away."
Okay. So a couple things with that story.
I've never heard that.
One, so one of the more goofy criticisms that maybe I'd imagine almost none of you have ever heard of it. This is actually one of the big criticisms of Mark. I've talked a lot about like Bart Ehrman. One of the big criticisms that Bart Ehrman makes is this exact passage, because he references Abiathar, the high priest. Well, we just read that story. Who was the high priest in that story?
Ahimelech.
It's Ahimelech. Ahimelech is Abiathar's father. And so a lot of people are like, oh, Mark got it wrong, or Jesus got it wrong. Who's the high priest? Therefore, like the whole gospel, like one is an error, one is an error. Like whole Bible's wrong. Like everything's wrong. Which, first of all, let's just say that it is.
Let's say it's the only error of the Bible.
It's a really dumb error. Like it's a really dumb error to like get upset about. Most for like a number of reasons, but also the number of like if you go watch like Mike Winger like talk about this, like, and he's right, like, and there's literally dozens of different plausible reasons as to why this is completely fine what he said.
Well, you've got just earlier in the chapter that Jesus calls a guy named Levi, and he's now Levi is now
Oh,
12.
maybe.
So it's
Well,
like
So
maybe he had a second name.
So the main thing is that Abiathar is Abimelech's or Ahimelech or whatever, the one that's actually mentioned. He's his son, right? And he will actually eventually be high priest. And very specifically, he actually becomes high priest when David takes over. He's David's high priest. And so because of that, one of the arguments that people make is that actually Abiathar historically is a much more well-known high priest. And so whenever it says in the time of Abiathar the high priest, he's just making a reference to like in the life of him and saying in the life of him, this very high, well-known, respected high priest, because remember, not all high priests were like well-respected. There's instances of high priests not being good guys. Read other chapters of Samuel to like find out about this, right? He's trying to say a really high respected high priest, whenever the really high and respected David went in there, David did something which was not lawful to do, right? And so remember how I said, I was like, his disciples technically aren't doing anything unlawful, and he's going to reference something that is explicitly not lawful and say that it was okay for that thing to happen. So right there, you have very clearly Jesus making this differentiation between you can have something that's not lawful, but if it's done properly and with the proper goals in mind and with the proper priority structure, it becomes okay. It doesn't become lawful. And that's an important distinction to make. And I think it's like, it's one of the things that I've talked about, like, there are actually numerous instances in the Bible of stuff like this. One of the big ones to me is when Rahab is lying to, and we've talked about that before. But when Rahab lies, and then later on in Hebrews, it says that's an act of faith, right? And it's like, okay, how do we struggle with that? Like, she sinned. She did something that was morally wrong. It's like, yeah, she did, but also God used that. And actually, in what she just read in Samuel, the fact that that event occurs, if you read just like a couple more verses underneath it, it literally says that because that happened, Saul, who was looking for David, finds out that he was there and goes after him. And it starts like the chain of events that eventually leads to David being put in charge, right? And so, like,
it's a problem.
Well, it's a perfect representation of what we just got done talking about in Joseph, right? Where an act can occur which we view as evil or wrong or as a thing that was not supposed to happen, but God views it as a thing that was supposed to happen then, because I have higher purposes in mind to make something go forth. And it doesn't, like, just because God meant it for good doesn't mean that it wasn't evil, right? Like, the act of Joseph being thrown into the pit was evil. The act of David doing this here was unlawful. Like, the act of Rahab lying was lying and was and like lying is something that is a sin that you're not supposed to do. But God can use even those things to make what he needs to have happen. And he has a through line and a direction of where he's going, and he's going to like make it work. And that's not a license to sin and to just go do whatever and to just Deus Vult and like crusade the world. Like that's not what it is. What it is to
motivation.
like right, yeah, there's motivation, but there's also like God's going to make things work according to his own will. Your job is to try and get along with that as best you can. And there'll be times where you fail, but even those failures are going to get used in a positive way. But that doesn't mean that you like relish them and that you continue to like hold on to them. You move like past them and you continue to do things right. David doesn't like turn around and just say, I'm going to start waltzing into the Holy of Holies whenever I want and just picking up showbread, right? Like that's not what he does, right? And it's not like we just go, oh, there we have a story here about people saying the Sabbath like doesn't matter and like he can do whatever he wants on the Sabbath. Therefore, boom, we ignore Sabbath. Sabbath doesn't mean nothing. Sabbath is crap. It's like, yeah, exactly. Like we're working every single day. Like no, that's not what it means. It means there's a time and a place. Okay.
What you got me thinking about while we were doing
Yeah.
that, well, when you opened the discussion, we're talking about like kind of the absurdities of how Jews like the lengths they go to in which they're believing that they're keeping a Sabbath. It did make me think more about the verse where he says, because the Sabbath, man was not made for the Sabbath,
Yeah.
the Sabbath was made for man. And more, I was like, okay, so let's see what was like the point of the Sabbath. And really, from what I went back to in Exodus, I'll paraphrase here, but he's saying that it's holy for you, speaking to the people of Israel, to hold the Sabbath, mostly because the Lord is holy, and the Lord kept the Sabbath in creation.
Right.
And what does it reference? Actually, when he does that, it says, 6 days shall work be done. The seventh day is a Sabbath, solemn rest, holy to the Lord. And it is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. So the point of a Sabbath is that you end up rested and refreshed.
Yeah.
So if you're preventing yourself from doing activities, but those activities would also actually be more restful
Yes.
and refreshing, then you are going against the idea of the Sabbath. And what you're doing
Waiting
instead,
longer for an oak.
what you're doing instead is you're kind of like trying to be subservient in worship to like a Sabbath God, and trying to find like all these little like things that they're doing are loopholes to appease the Sabbath God.
Right.
Instead of taking the Sabbath as what it was intended for, it was intended to be restful and holy to them.
And not to be like 100% against like how Jews treat the Sabbath, because at a certain fundamental level, I think even modern Jews do kind of recognize this in certain facets. And one of which is that the way that like I've always heard like Jewish commentators, Ben Shapiro included, is that the priority is always on life. And so because of that, that's primarily why doctors are permitted to work on Sabbath.
Right.
Like they're allowed to do their work that is like necessary for saving lives.
Because it'd be really dumb for a punishment that's like breaking the Sabbath is punishable by death, but it'd be really dumb for having someone be dying and be like, sorry, we can't help you.
Right.
You're dead either way.
If we helped you, we
Should have
die.
been sick yesterday.
Right. And so like while there is a lot of like
come on.
stuff that I do think is them doing precisely what you just said, that fundamental truth is still there, like embedded in it. And that was like the next part that I was going to talk about is the Sabbath was not made for man, but man for the Sabbath. not man for the Sabbath. Yeah, no, wait, no. I
You
said
flipped it when you said it.
the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
You said not on the first line.
Oh, my bad. Whatever.
We all know what you're talking about.
Yeah. But the thing that I want to talk about to close is the line of the Son of Man is a Lord even of the Sabbath. And again, you have this same idea of where he throws in this quick line at the end of the Son of Man is a Lord even of the Sabbath. And so he just said that the Sabbath is made for man. And so if you have this idea that the Son of Man is just kind of like it's just like his humanist thing, but it's just a reflection of himself. The line of is the Lord even of the Sabbath is a weird line, especially whenever you consider that, like, if you go back to like Old Testament references, like what you read, right? The Lord of the Sabbath, it's not going to say it in the text, right? Because in the text it'll say like, it says that day belong, or like that it is a Sabbath to, or it is the Sabbath of the Lord your God of, and it's going to be Yahweh
It
Elohim.
says, above all, you shall keep my Sabbath.
You keep my, right. So like the person that owns the Sabbath, right, is Yahweh in the Old Testament, right? And so whenever he calls himself the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, that is a way, again, it's another cryptic way of Jesus being like, I am God,
Yeah.
right? So again, we like, in almost every chapter of Mark, there's going to be like some way where Jesus is like calling himself God, but he doesn't directly call himself God. You just have to understand what it is that he's saying. So whenever he says, the Son of Man is the Lord even on the Sabbath, he's calling himself God by proxy, by taking the titles of the things that apply to Yahweh, right? Which is the thing that he even does like at the end, right? With we've heard. So any more questions, comments, anything?
Just that because of the way God goes about making the Sabbath as part of the covenant, that I do understand why Jews get so serious about it.
Oh,
Because
yes.
the punishment for breaking the Sabbath is death.
Yes.
And the concept of doing something incredibly innocuous being punishable by death is bound to lead to very bizarre workarounds.
And we want to get this right,
right,
so that we're not just like dropping people,
right.
So
I can, because of like the combination of like, this is meant to be a good, fun, refreshing time, combined with, if you don't get refreshed on this day, I swear you're going down, son. I can understand why, like, culturally that developed, especially over a long period of time. It's a very weird habit.
And I can understand why I would denounce my religion if I grew up with that.
Right.
Like, that'd be such a turnoff.
And and you also, it's one of the things where personally, I think it's one of the reasons why we don't, because you hear that, right? And you think, why would a just God ever make the punishment for not following the Sabbath death?
Well, I can think of a couple reasons why.
Well, the main, and this is one of the things where it's like, you have to understand the cultural context and the expectations of how things worked at the time in order to understand why that was the punishment. Because primarily, the reason why it was a punishment was because, and every other surrounding culture, there were no days of rest. You worked every single day. And also, you as an individual typically didn't own things. You didn't own land. You rented it from the king, the local warlord, whatever. They're the ones that owned it, and they rented it out to you, or you were like a serf, and you had to work every single day, and you were expected to work every single day. And so really the people that are going to be violating the Sabbath are the people that are making other people work on those days. And so they're the ones that would be killed, right? So if someone's working on the Sabbath, it's because it's the people that are over them that are making them work. And so you go after them. And all of Israel's early paradigm of how they're setting up their society is as a decentralized collective, that the person that's at the top is Yahweh and not a king. That's their whole system. It's their whole game. Like it kind of really is. And they have this whole system like worked out. And like this is why you can't just like divorce parts of like the system and be like, oh, this is kind of why I'm like, as Christians that are like so like taken out of like the Israel system, why we can't be hard and fast about like, oh, we have to follow all of the laws of like the Old Testament, because some of the laws of the Old Testament, we fundamentally have no basis for keeping them at all. Like, how exactly are we supposed to maintain like ancestral allotments of plots of Israel? Like, we don't live in the country. We have no, like, we're not a part
It's
of
like
the
gender. You get to choose what tribe of Israel.
yeah. Are we choosing what tribe we're in? Like what?
Or maybe it's an astrology.
Like, what does that even mean? But it's like
Identify.
if you don't understand that, like,
Only November 1st,
like that is like
you're
really super important to like understanding how the structure of like all the laws go together and how everything functions as like a cohesive unit. You're just going to be tossing your hands up as to like, how are we supposed to implement all these things? And you're going to come up with really weird and goofy things. And so,
But I definitely
it makes sense as to I see and understand that progression, but also it's one of the things where I think Christians are in a better framework to make those understandings work, because we don't have right just what Jesus is saying. We're in a position where we can break the law. We can do things that are not lawful, quote unquote, but we're still fulfilling the spirit of the law and what it's intended to, because we know the heart of Christ and we know the heart of God, and we understand why those things were implemented and enacted.
Knowing Him
allows us to apply those truths in our context.
Yes, he's the Lord of this.
And exactly. And so it's that same like framing thing that I talked about. It's like he frames that situation, and so it shows up in that cultural context in that way. And so we can take him and we understand him and we can apply him to ourselves today.
Right. But it was also the like and again, another practical reason why I can think of why breaking the Sabbath would be punishable by death, and like the combination of a very harsh punishment to a very innocuous crime is really because, like, if there isn't such a harsh punishment, people would roll over that rule all the time, and it's like it would have been a big deal, and there's a lot of tyranny that can actually come out of that, especially since at the time, like, slavery was definitely around and pretty prevalent.
No, really started in like 1625.
1618. So that in 1619 they started coming over here. It was like a 1 year delay.
Right.
Back straight.
No, my bad. I'll fix it on Juneteenth this year.
American issue.
But
The only people that have ever been slaves.
right. But yeah, it would have been really easy, even for another culture or even just a sub faction, to try and like just start working all the time.
Oh yeah.
If the punishment wasn't so great. I think it's kind of the reason why it came down is it's a juxtaposition, but it makes sense, because if the punishment wasn't so severe to such an innocuous crime, then people would just always do the crime.
Mm-hmm.
It was a labor law.
Yeah, it was
It-
labor law.
it was-
And
it was a labor
it's
law.
pretty much it's kind of the reason why we don't
Anti-labor.
really feel it so much now because we have like a fairly standardized 5-day work week.
Yeah.
Trust Buster Yahweh.
But I don't think there's like no way we would have.
There's kind of a lot of that actually.
I don't think we would have got to a standardized 5-hour work week without precedent.
No,
No,
we probably wouldn't have. No. Oh yeah.
Which is why God should have created heavens and earth in 5 days. It was a 4-day work.
yeah. Why didn't God?
But still
learn-
7 days.
why didn't God do a 3-day work week? Come
Or
on.
God at least make it 2 days of rest, 8-day week.
Ah,
God, couldn't you have done like a type 10?
why didn't God use the
Type
metric
10
system?
minutes of creation for the week.